Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 28th episode of The Greats of History, the podcast where we get to know people with the epithet of the Great and try to get past the honorific and understand who they were, what they did, and why some people seem to like them so much. I am grateful that you are here. Last time, we tracked the course of Roman history, albeit somewhat haphazardly, from its founding by the mythical twin brothers Romulus and Remus, through the tremors of the Social War, and into the earthquake of Rome's first major civil war, also known to history as the Marian-Sullan Wars. In that episode, I offered the qualifier that the Social War was a complex and chaotic conflict, and that I would be only picking and choosing aspects of it that were critical to laying the groundwork for Pompey. That we did, as this conflict got us up close and personal with Pompey and his father, Pompey Strabo. As we dive a bit more into the concluding phases of the sprawling Marian-Sullan War, I need to double down on my hand-wringing qualification. Rome had flirted with and occasionally participated in civil war, but the one we are about to dive back into was a different kind of animal altogether. It was on a grand scale, unfolding across all of Italy and spilling into the provinces. The sizes of the adversarial forces were enormous, and the level of detail around the battles, feints, twists, and turns are almost dizzying. Once again, this isn't a history of the Civil War, but the Civil War is vital to the story of Pompey, so we will cover certain aspects of it. To recap, this war pitted the conservative faction led by a very unamused Lucius Cornelius Sulla against the populist revolutionaries led by Lucius Cornelius Cinna, a competent yet violent leader who overtook leadership of the faction when Gaius Marius finally died in 86 BCE in the middle of his seventh and disastrous consulship. Sulla and Cinna. Last week, we left off in 83 BCE with a decidedly displeased Sulla marching at the head of a very angry veteran army. They had just arrived back in Italy after securing a decisive victory against, but enacting a surprisingly lenient peace treaty with, the Pontic king Mithridates. You may remember him from such previous episodes as Mithridates the Great. Go back and listen. Sulla was seething because, once again, while he was off fighting for the Republic, the populist agitators had displaced him from his command, violently persecuted conservatives, and rammed through a radical reform agenda that deeply offended Sulla's aristocratic sensibilities. The first time this had happened, Sulla had turned around and marched on Rome, dealing with the issue before sailing east. This time, Sulla ignored the challenge to his authority until he'd good and whipped Mithridates. Then he came home to deal with his enemies, bent on a final and permanent settlement to the ongoing populist agitation. Sulla's arrival back in Rome in the spring of 83 BCE cast a pall over Italy. His previous march on Rome, in 88 BCE, the first such action in the city's long history, had alienated many people. Never before had any Roman commander brought armed troops into the city to menace the populace. Yet, by 83 BCE, the current regime in control, those populist adversaries of the conservative Sullans, had persecuted rivals, disregarded the constitution, and subverted legitimately elected and appointed officials and commanders. The populace stacked the Senate to cloak their actions in the veneer of legality and violently suppressed, often with murder, the conservatives, brave or dumb enough to speak out against the populists. The lines between the Sullans on one side and the Marians, now led by Cinna, on the other, were drawn in blood. Animosity ran deep. There was little room for neutrality. Leading citizens were expected to pick a side and be ready to fight. The looming conflict promised to engulf Italy in a spasm of bloodshed and violence. The Senate, now packed with Cinna's cronies, declared Sulla an outlaw, an enemy of the state. Sulla had been an active and brutal commander during the Social War, and the memory of his actions loomed large in the imagination of the Allies. You may recall that one of the core issues of the Social War was whether or not to extend the rights of citizenship to all Allied Italian cities. The populace wanted to extend Roman citizenship, and all the rights that came with it, to these allies. The conservatives wanted to keep these rights solely in the hands of the elites in the capital city. The Social War had been concluded in 88 BCE, and these allies had just recently been brought into the Roman franchise. But the memory of Sulla's brutal campaign against the allies was still fresh. Many of these allies lined up with Cinna and against Sulla. And it's not like the Marian-Cinnan faction was the only one that had trampled on the constitution. Sulla himself, despite all his lofty appeals to conservative tradition, was the one who brought his own army against the beating heart of the burgeoning empire, the Eternal City itself. Coupled with the resentment of Sulla over his defilement of the constitution in 88 BCE, the lingering resentment from the allied cities and the people enabled the Sinans to muster a massive force to oppose Sulla. For his part, the general's army had fought its way east and then back again. These were veterans, battle-tested and of proven ability. They were also rich, the eastern campaign against Mithridates having poured treasure into Sulla's coffers and, critically, into the pockets of his soldiers. The bond between commander and army was sincere and deep. A veteran army, ferociously dedicated to its commander. His fight was their fight. Up in his home turf of Picenum, the young Pompey considered what to do as the two sides in the conflict geared up for civil war. His father had sought to parlay the previous flare-up of civil war into a bidding war for his services. But the younger Pompey was impetuous and dispensed with any such equivocation. He acted decisively. As the two sides circled around one another, Pompey decisively threw in his lot with Sulla. With no formal authority to do so, the young Pompey raised an army from the veterans of his father's campaign. From his own resources, he outfitted the troops with weapons, baggage, provisions, clothing, everything they would need, his own private army. Anything that you want to keep cool. Pompey's only experience in warfare had been serving as a junior subordinate in his father's social war campaign, but regardless, the young Pompey, now 23 years old, appointed himself as commander of this upstart force, one of dubious legality. He readied his army and began to march it south toward the coastal city of Brundisium, where Sulla was preparing for his own campaign. That so many of these veterans signed up to serve under Pompey does undermine the idea that Pompey Strabo's troops hated him, even if they were paid handsomely to join on the sun. The formation of this extra-legal army was a chilling development for the senatorial faction. The young Pompey might have been an unknown commodity, but a veteran force of proven ability, allying themselves with Sulla, was a disturbing development, and they hastily dispatched not one, but 3 commanders to confront the young upstart. When the adversaries confronted one another, Pompey and his men were vastly outnumbered and entirely surrounded. Pompey acted with bold decisiveness. He personally mounted a horse and led the cavalry in a direct assault on the senatorial forces, his army fast on his heels. His aggressive action threw the enemy into chaos. Their cavalry fled, and the battle quickly turned into a rout. When danger reared its ugly head, the senatorial forces quickly turned their tails and fled. Despite being drastically outnumbered, Pompey's private army proved itself. Area cities, understanding the significance of the victory, came over to Pompey, spreading his influence across the countryside. Rather than check Pompey before he could gain any momentum, the incompetence of the senatorial forces had only given Pompey greater strength and confidence. Resolved to cut down this arrogant young upstart, and desperate to prevent him from linking up and joining forces with Sulla, the Senate next sent an army under the direct command of one of the year's consuls, Scipio Asiaticus. But when the two sides stood opposite one another, Scipio's army defected en masse to Pompey, and the consul fled the field. If the troops had little to no loyalty to their commander, then why risk dying for someone else's cause, especially fighting other Romans? Pompey had all the momentum, and so Scipio's men just shrugged, walked into Pompey's camp, and declared themselves for him. In the blink of an eye, Pompey roughly doubled his forces without a single arrow shot, spear thrust, or sword swung. He might have been only 23, but all of a sudden he had troops, territory, and a surging reputation behind him. With nothing standing between him and his intended ally, Pompey marched towards Sulla's camp. As he neared, Pompey arranged his army in a marching formation and took great care to parade with great pomp and ceremony, signaling his respect for and intention to serve under Sulla. Impressed and grateful to have his army bolstered by these veteran soldiers, Sulla dismounted his own horse and approached Pompey on foot. The younger man hailed the older general as imperator, the Latin word for conqueror, the root of our word emperor, and showed his senior all due respect. Sulla surprised everyone, probably including Pompey, by returning the salutation, likewise hailing the younger man as imperator. This honorific was a very big deal in ancient Rome, and was one by which the triumphant commander could refer to themselves for the rest of their lives. Given that he was only 23, Pompey would have a long time to enjoy this prestigious title. Any lingering doubt about Pompey's status evaporated when Sulla loudly and publicly hailed Pompey as imperator. In the early phases of the Civil War, Pompey had demonstrated strong leadership skills by rallying veterans to his banner and organizing his fledgling army. He also proved his abilities as a logistician, planning for all aspects of the campaign, and his military prowess, both leading his army and demonstrating his personal bravery. Now, linked up with Sulla and bathed in honors, the young Pompey established himself as one of Sulla's most trusted lieutenants. Sulla's first mission for his new protege was to raise more troops. Pompey headed back to his home base of Picenum, where, bolstered by his string of successes, enlistees flocked to his banner, and more Pompeian veterans came out of retirement and enlisted in the new campaign. This mission successfully accomplished, Sulla attached Pompey to the command of his ally, the Roman conservative noble Metellus Pius. For Metellus, the campaign against the populists was deeply personal. Metellus' father was the same guy that had helped get Marius his first command, whom Marius then betrayed and drove into exile. Son had relentlessly lobbied on behalf of the father, seeking his return. This paternal devotion had won for himself the cognomen of Pius and a lifelong hatred of the Marians. Marius might be dead, but Metellus Pius seethed for a chance to avenge the populist insult to his father's and family's honor. Together, Metellus and Pompey fought a series of brutal battles against the senatorial forces, and Pompey showed the depth of his skill and tactical genius in these critical campaigns. During the various maneuvers and battles, at one point in 82 BCE, Pompey found himself linked up with another Sullan ally, Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus, another ambitious young noble, anxious to put himself in the service of Sulla, had taken his own circuitous route to the Sullan camp. He is such a vital figure in the story of Pompey, and for that matter, the entire history of Rome, that it's worth spending just a minute to get to know him, even if it requires us going back a bit in time to do so. 9 years the senior of Pompey, Marcus Licinius Crassus was born in 115 BCE to an ancient and financially successful plebeian family. Despite their lack of patrician rank, the Licinii had produced several important men of distinction, including his father, Publius Licinius Crassus, who served as consul in 95 BCE and censor in 89 BCE. During the on-again, off-again conflicts between the Marians and Sullans, Publius Crassus had sided with Sulla. When Sulla was off fighting Mithridates and the Marians seized control, they unleashed a bloody purge of political enemies, brutally executing those deemed enemies of the state. In these proscriptions, Crassus's brother and father were murdered, and to save his own life, he fled to Spain, where his family had many clients. Even this far away from the bloodshed in Rome, Crassus feared for his life. He had reason to. The Marians were relentless, and they had their own partisans everywhere. They also had appropriated all of Crassus's family wealth and assets. At first, Crassus took refuge in a cave, staying out of sight and relying on a trusted ally to bring him provisions. Eventually, Crassus came out of the cave and recruited a small army of his own, roughly 2,500 men strong. This unit thus equated to roughly half the strength of the standard Roman legion. With these troops at his back, Crassus began extorting local towns for cash, bribing them into quote-unquote protection payments in order to avoid attack. While this extortion did little to bolster Crassus' local popularity, it did start to replenish his coffers. As time would tell, Crassus had a gift for making money, often through means of questionable ethics. Bent on revenge and eager to reestablish his family fortune, Crassus set sail for North Africa, where he met up with Metellus Pius, himself in exile from the Marians and not yet returned to Italy to play his part in the looming civil war. The two scions of persecuted families had little in common, beyond their mutual hatred of the Marians. Crassus thus continued on to Greece to meet up with Sulla, who at the time was planning to set sail back for Italy with his veteran army following his defeat of Mithridates. Sulla greeted Crassus with tremendous honor and gave the younger man pride of place in his army and his inner circle. He would repeat this action down the line with Pompey in the events described previously. Sulla is a complicated figure. It has come down as one of the most controversial in all of Roman history, but he clearly had an eye for talent. For his part, Crassus was proved to be a deeply loyal subordinate to Sulla, provided a boon to the general's chances in the civil war, and played a pivotal role in the decisive battle at the conclusion of the war. By 82 BCE, Pompey and Crassus were shoulder to shoulder, fighting against the government forces in the raging civil war. The senatorial faction was now led by another populist revolutionary, Gnaeus Papirius Carbo. Carbo had assumed the leadership of the Marians back in 84 BCE when Cinna had been murdered by his own troops, themselves reluctant to continue a bloody civil war against their countrymen. Thus paired up, in a battle near the city of Spolitium, Smack in the middle of the Italian peninsula, the duo of Pompey and Crassus teamed up to smack their adversaries senseless. The commander of the enemy army, Gaius Carinus, managed to flee. Meanwhile, Sulla cut a swathe across Italy and generally got the better of confrontations with his adversaries. He eventually laid siege to the key senatorial stronghold of Praeneste, with Gaius Marius the Younger holed up behind the city walls. Marius was consul for the year, only 27. He had never previously held an elected office. The only thing he brought to the campaign was his name, but his name was considerable. And as long as there was a Marius in the field, then there was a banner to which anti-Sullans could flock. Marius the Younger was more symbolically than strategically important. The senatorial forces tried time and again to break through the Sullan lines in order to relieve the city of Praeneste. A massive army of 8 legions under the command of Gaius Marcius Censorius was mustered and sent to confront Sulla outside the city. Pompey took up position in the narrow pass on the way to the city and waited. When the government forces were making their way through the defile, Pompey sent his troops crashing down, ambushing and routing Censorius's shocked troops. Of the approximately 40,000 troops that began the march to lift the siege, about 3,500, less than 1 legion, remained in the field, more than a 90% reduction. Pompey scored a huge victory for the Sullans, and the combined effects of all these victories meant that the government cause was on life support. The leader of their efforts, Carbo, fled Italy for Africa, though he never made it past Sicily. Frustrated in all attempts to lift the siege, and with their war effort crumbling, the few government forces made a last desperate gasp. They gathered up the allied tribes that still seethed at Sulla for his brutality in the social war and made a sprint for Rome, which the Sullans controlled but had left only lightly defended. It was a bold gambit, and Sulla realized with horror that if the enemy could seize Rome, then it could bolster their flagging campaign, and all his endless string of battlefield victories could be undone in one fell swoop. He left a force in the field to keep Marius pinned down in Praeneste, and frantically force-marched his troops toward the capital in a race against the enemy. The allied tribes, the Samnites and the Lucanians, arrived at Rome ahead of Sulla, but the defenders in Rome managed to delay an all-out assault just long enough to allow the Sullans to make it to the city, take a deep breath, and organize themselves for the final showdown. But still, his troops were exhausted from the epic sprint to the city, and their fierce tribal warriors were formidable. Sulla arrived at Rome around noon on November 1st, 82 BCE. His commanders encouraged him to rest his men and remind him that the Samnites and the Lucanians were not to be taken lightly. Perhaps emboldened by all his successes, Sulla shrugged off the warnings, only giving his weary troops time for a meal and a short rest. He then promptly arrayed them into formation outside one of the gates of Rome, called the Colline Gate. The caution of his commanders was justified, and the fighting went badly for Sulla. His left wing was completely overrun, being driven back so that the men were fighting with the city wall at their back. Sulla tried everything he could to reorganize his troops and to mount a counterattack, but they were scattered, demoralized, and on the brink of being completely obliterated. Just when all seemed lost, a messenger from Crassus made it to Sulla. Crassus had taken control of the Sullan right wing, and while the left was getting battered, Crassus had destroyed the enemy opposite his wing, putting them to flight and standing triumphant on his part of the battlefield. Crassus wanted to know from Sulla what to do next. Relieved, Sulla used this great news to rally the morale of his left wing, and he coordinated with Crassus on the attack of the enemy. The momentum turned, and while the battle raged on into the night, by morning the Sullan victory was complete. Tens of thousands lay dead on the battlefield. All the key commanders of the Marian, Samnite, and Lucanian forces that had been on the battlefield were captured. The Battle of the Colline Gate was the final major and decisive victory for Sulla in the civil war. It was a landmark battle, a victory only made possible by the energy and success of Crassus. There would be resistance for years to come. For example, I mentioned last week that a Marian commander named Quintus Sertorius set up shop in Spain and led a brilliant guerrilla resistance to Sullan rule. More on that to come. But Sulla's control of Rome would never again be contested. For his part, Pompey arrived just in time to see Sulla and Crassus triumphant. The day after the battle, Sulla called the Senate to meet him near the Temple of Bellona, goddess of war. He gave a stirring speech. Or maybe it was a dud. Who knows? It was kind of hard to hear, because, to make a dramatic and horrifying point, Sulla had 3,000 of the Samnite and Lucanian prisoners rounded up and slaughtered. Their shrieks of terror drowned out his words. He just cold-bloodedly stood there and talked while the slaughter said more than any words could anyway. In a preview of the further bloodletting to come, Sulla next ordered the captured enemy commanders brought before him. Then he watched as they were all beheaded. Determined to stamp out every last bit of resistance, he marched to Praeneste to end the long siege there. He ordered the head of the Samnite commander, a brilliant general and ferocious warrior named Pontius Telesnius, thrown into the city in order to send a message to the holdouts. Understanding that the last armies capable of relieving the city had been destroyed, the disconsolate Praenestans surrendered the city. Gaius Marius the Younger, son of the great Marius, hid in a tunnel and committed suicide. Utterly ruthless in victory as well as battle, Sulla ordered the native men and Samnite allies of the city slaughtered to a man. The Roman citizens he allowed to leave. He turned his men loose on the rich city and it was viciously sacked. Much of its territory was appropriated as a military colony for his veterans. Marius's head was sent to Rome, and Sulla promptly had it displayed on the Forum. The general was said to mock the corpse of his young fallen enemy, taunting the head that, quote, "First you learn to row before you try to steer," close quote. Sulla's total victory was a boon to the career of Pompey. He had thrown in his lot with the rebel and fought for and with Sulla in his seizure of the Roman state. For his part, Sulla was pleased with his young general, so much so that he pushed for greater alliance between the two. As we concluded part 1 on this episode of Pompey, we learned that part of the way that Pompey was ensured his acquittal as he stood trial to face the embezzlement charges against his late father was that he'd agreed to marry Antistia, the daughter of the presiding judge. She had been dealing with her own grief during the Civil War, as her father, Antistius, had been murdered by the Marian faction in 82 BCE as Sulla was closing in on Rome. Now that Sulla was in control, he decided that Pompey should divorce the poor girl and marry his own stepdaughter, Aemilia. Her mother was so distraught by all these events that she committed suicide. For her part, the poor Aemilia was not only married, but pregnant. No matter. Sulla coolly forced the end of the marriage and arranged her wedding to Pompey. How Pompey felt about this was not to be recorded. For her part, the poor Aemilia died in childbirth shortly thereafter. Antistia falls out of the historical record, and nothing is known about how she spent the balance of her days. Not all the members of the Marian faction had fallen in battle. By 81 BCE, Carbo, the former consul and leader of the Marian faction following the death of Cinna, was in Sicily. He had plans to join up with other holdouts in North Africa and rebuild their power base, a tactic they had used previously. Such a threat to his power could not be tolerated, and Sulla dispatched Pompey to Sicily to confront his adversary and any Marian partisans. Pompey took to this task with great zeal, and in short order, Carbo was caught and brought before Pompey in fetters. The smug Pompey stood trial over the disgraced former consul, then duly ordered him executed. Carbo was beheaded, and so too was the Marian cause. Pompey then proceeded to track down and liquidate all of Sulla's enemies in Sicily. Pompey was so swift and brutal in the discharge of his orders that Pompey's enemies took to calling him the Adolescentialis Carnifex, or teenage butcher. Back in Rome, Sulla likewise terrorized his enemy. At first, he promised to simply target only the most committed Marians. He posted in the Forum a list of enemies whose lives and property were deemed to be forfeit. They were to be hunted down and killed, their estates and property to be seized and auctioned off. The Marians had conducted proscriptions in this manner, but Sulla formalized the process, publishing a list of the victims in the Forum. The first list contained the names of 40 men of senatorial rank. The next day, he added a couple more. Well, a couple hundred more, and then another couple hundred. Anyone suspected of having any sympathy with the Marian faction was added to the list. Fear and paranoia gripped the city. Bounties were placed on citizens' heads. People hunted each other for reward money. Some people used the situation to settle personal vendettas, inventing false allegiances to ensure that their personal enemies wound up dead. Rich citizens found their names on the list under trumped-up pretenses just so their property could be put up for auction. Neighbors turned on neighbors, family members accused and betrayed each other, spies and informants hid in attics, behind doorways, around corners, listening for even the slightest word, uttered in private, to use as an excuse to add hapless victims to the growing list. And all the while, the blood flowed. First hundreds, then thousands of people ended up on Sulla's proscription lists. Death squads stalked the city and out into the countryside. Even the slightest perceived disloyalty could land someone on a list. Heads rolled in a very literal sense, and each one was a trophy to the regime, displayed on pikes in the forum. As many as 9,000 people were killed in Sulla's proscription. The city was a nightmare, gruesome, macabre, soaked in blood. Corpses rotting where they lay or choking the river Tiber. Even showing public mourning for the deceased could be enough to warrant another round of death. Victims lay where they fell. Even those that had been dead before Sulla arrived in Rome were not safe. On Sulla's orders, men broke into Marius's tomb, Marius the Elder, scattered his bones and ashes, and destroyed the tomb. A final act of vengeance from Sulla to Marius. Now, we need to catch up with Pompey, but Sulla's proscriptions are a good time to introduce another critical character onto the stage. You may recall that the Marian faction was led by a radical populist named Cinna. Cinna had left the scene in 84 BCE when the 4-time consul was murdered by his own troops in the prologue to the fighting against Sulla. Cinna's daughter, Cornelia, had been a teenage bride to another young Roman noble, either just before or after her father's death. The young noble was thus the son-in-law to one of Sulla's most avowed enemies. But to make matters worse for this young man, he was also the nephew of a noblewoman named Julia, who had been married to none other than Marius, making Marius his uncle. Strike two. Marius and Cinna had even appointed this promising young man to a prestigious priesthood, placing him up in a position of power that would be an affront to Sulla's regime. So there is strike three. Even though this young man had never uttered a word against Sulla and took no actions to oppose him, he was guilty by association and sentenced to die. This young noble, himself about 6 years Pompey's junior, fled Rome, hiding during the day and moving only at night. At one point, he was caught by a patrol, but managed to bribe his way to freedom. In time, those few influential people in his life that had escaped the death squads managed to corner Sulla and lobby for his removal from the proscriptions. Sulla let himself be persuaded, but cautioned everyone that the ambition of this young man would prove to be problematic. In this, Sulla was right, and it's thanks to this unusual and decidedly out-of-character act of clemency that Gaius Julius Caesar managed to escape the death squads and begin his public career. Now, if you've read any of my books, you will know that I find Caesar fascinating, utterly and completely fascinating. He is timeless. His life was full of adventure, bravado, cunning, a larger-than-life man, the stuff of legend. He's worth getting to know, and of course, he will feature more prominently in the story of Pompey, but we will leave him for now and catch up with the teenage butcher as he embarks on his next big move. After all, this is really Pompey's story. Now, I also should say that name was a bit unfair, as Pompey was in his 20s. The butcher part was pretty true to life, though. After crushing all semblance of resistance in Sicily, Pompey received orders from Sulla to move his forces to North Africa and confront the dying embers of Marian resistance there. He duly did so, setting sail with 120 warships and a further 800 transports. As soon as he landed, 7,000 of his adversary's troops switched allegiance and flocked to his banner. To many of these troops, fighting other Romans was of questionable value. Why put your life on the line? Fighting some other politician's fight. What mattered was not being right. What mattered was being on the winning side. Pompey had all the momentum, and the legionaries were anxious to side with the winner. Not all their adversaries were so quick to abandon the cause. But bolstered by his augmented forces, Pompey smashed the armies of another rival, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus. Of the 20,000 troops that lined up against Pompey, all but 3,000 perished. Once again, Pompey's troops hailed him as Imperator. To be twice hailed at such a young age was nearly unprecedented. His legend grew. Ahenobarbus was captured and brought before Pompey. Despite the impeccable nobility of his ancient family, Ahenobarbus suffered the same fate as all the enemies of the Sullan regime, and like his master in Rome, Pompey didn't think twice about slaughtering a vanquished foe. As an aside, Ahenobarbus' younger brother, Lucius, managed to avoid the conflict and keep his head on. Literally. I mention this only because Lucius Ahenobarbus was the great-great-grandfather of the future Emperor Nero, and such connections are quite fun. This particular Ahenobarbus will re-enter the picture a bit down the road as well, and he will be involved in the final battle of Pompey's storied career. While in Africa, Pompey also intervened in local politics, capturing and killing the king of Numidia and restoring a pro-Sullan ruler on the throne. It was after this last victory that Pompey's troops began to get a sense that their commander was marked for greatness. Perhaps it was his young age, his boundless ambition, or they had a near-perfect streak of victories. Or maybe he won their acclaim due to his tendency to personally lead from the front, leading the charge at the head of his men. Pompey reminded his troops of another conqueror first and ask questions later commander, a certain Macedonian king who lived a few centuries earlier. With Alexander in mind, Pompey's troops hailed their general as Magnus, or the Great. This makes Pompey the first person we've discussed in this series who was called the Great in their own lifetime, and him in his 20s. And he was definitely off to a promising start in his career, reputation for brutality notwithstanding. But truth be told, his acclamation as great was a little farcical. For one thing, he was in his mid-20s, and he'd only fought other Romans. For another, he wasn't even the leader of his own faction, being clearly subordinate to and significantly less accomplished than Sulla. But still, a title like that was too good to pass up, and for his part, Pompey was delighted by it. But in an unusual act of restraint, he held off from adopting it personally. He had no problems when other people used it, though. He had executed his orders, and his enemies, with ruthless precision. Sicily and North Africa were subdued, resistance to the Sullan regime hunted to extinction everywhere except in Spain. With all the defections on his side, Pompey ended his campaign with more troops than when he'd started, even after fighting several pitched battles. It was time to come home and to bring his cool new nickname Magnus with him. When Pompey arrived in Rome, a few things were quite different. The months-long reign of terror burned itself out after a few months, and clearly there were several thousand dead Romans just not around anymore. For his part, Sulla parlayed the horrors of the proscription into an appointment as dictator. Traditionally, this role had a 6-month expiration date, but Sulla cowed the Senate into an open-ended appointment, and the meek popular assembly ratified the decision. At this point, it might be fair to suspect that Sulla was a radical, a bloodthirsty tyrant, hell-bent on upsetting the Roman order. All of this is true, except that Sulla was, paradoxically, deeply conservative. He saw himself as fighting against and purging Rome from populist reform. His role, as he saw it, was to restore Rome to the rigid hierarchy of patrician and senatorial oligarchy. He wanted to make sure that there could never be another Marius, or even, for that matter, another Sulla. The reforms of Sulla are another of the long, complex diversions that are interesting, but do sort of distract us from the story. In short, some of the key features of Sulla's program were diminishing the power of the popular assemblies, increasing the size of the Senate from 300 to 600, the ranks of which were, of course, filled out by men loyal to the regime, stripping the responsibility for the courts away from the equites, the knightly class of Rome, and giving it back to the senators, requiring the senior-most elected magistrates to serve their term of office in Rome, and reestablishing the convention that any official had to wait 10 years before they could hold the same office again. Sulla also formalized and codified the cursus honorum, the course of honors, the system by which public officials ran for increasingly senior magistracies, which were in turn fewer in number. These offices were tribune, quaestor, aedile, praetor, and of course, consul. Each office had a minimum age requirement, and it was considered a very big deal indeed to win an office in your year, i.e. in the first year one was eligible to run. The minimum age for the consulship, for example, was 42. Cicero, about whom there's lots more to come, crowed incessantly about winning the consulship in his year, when he was 42. All of this was well and good, but when Pompey arrived back in Rome as a brash 25-year-old, the idea of waiting 17 years to reach the heights of Roman society did not hold much appeal to him. Pompey wanted his glory, and he wanted it now. Perhaps to soothe Pompey's ambition, Sulla traveled outside to meet Pompey as he was marching towards Rome, ostentatiously calling him Pompey Magnus, or Pompey the Great, for all the world to hear. It was one thing to have troops in the field hail their commander as the Great. It was another thing entirely for the undisputed and sole ruler of Rome, the dictator for life, to do so. If the name was offered to Pompey on shaky foundations, then there would be no further doubt about its legitimacy. Not only did Pompey become Pompey the Great in his own lifetime, but he was also so called in his mid-20s. Truly unprecedented. Now, There is another interpretation of Sulla's use of Magnus when dealing with his subordinate. It seems possible, even plausible, that Sulla was using the term a bit ironically, taking a dig at Pompey's lofty ego. After all, there's no way that Sulla would have seen Pompey as anything greater than himself, and Sulla sure didn't give himself, or cow anyone to labeling him with such an epithet. But no matter how Sulla had intended it, Pompey had the title of the Great, and he would be able to carry it with great pride for the rest of his life. Still, Pompey was not mollified. He demanded of Sulla the right to hold a triumph, the celebratory victory parade that could enshrine a Roman commander in the pantheon of all-time greats. In this, Sulla refused. According to tradition and to Sulla's own reforms, a Roman must have attained the rank of praetor or consul before they could triumph, and Pompey was far too young for either post and had held neither. Frustrated, Pompey refused to disband his army until his triumph was approved. Sulla was not moved. A headstrong Pompey then quipped that people worshipped a rising sun more than a setting one, a clear allusion to Pompey's ascendancy and Sulla's growing years. Exacerbated, the dictator gave in, threw his hands up, and shouted, "Let him triumph! Let him triumph!" But to dilute the attention Pompey would receive, Sulla granted triumphs to 2 other generals as well. Undeterred, the grandiose Pompey organized a massive parade. His coup de grace was that his chariot would be pulled, not by horses as per custom, but by 4 elephants. This farce was only prevented by the size of the beasts, which were too big to pass through the gates into the city. A mildly disappointed Pompey switched to horses, but carried on. By allowing Pompey to flaunt the rules, Sulla's reforms began to be unwound before his term of dictator even ended. In 80 BCE, while still a dictator, Sulla stood for the consulship along his colleague and partner Metellus Pius. Shortly after taking office, he resigned the dictatorship and made a grand show of laying down all the honors and protections it had afforded. He even dismissed his bodyguard and walked around the forum conversing with any Roman who wanted a word. Considering how many Romans Sulla had participated in the murder of, this was actually a pretty ballsy move. When his consulship ended, Sulla retired, believing that his reforms had set Rome back on solid footing. Sulla did not have long to enjoy his retirement. Later writers claimed he lived a debauched and drunken lifestyle and that this hastened his demise. Others say that he was consumed by a gruesome disease. There seemed to be some invention around this, used by later moralizers who wanted to paint the brutal dictator in the worst possible light. Either way, in 78 BCE, Sulla died at his estate south of Rome. The size and scale of his public funeral was unprecedented. His troops accompanied the body, which was placed upon a golden funeral bier in the forum. The most gifted orators gave elaborate speeches, tripping over themselves to pour fulsome praise on the life and legacy of Sulla. When his pyre burned out, his ashes were removed to his tomb on the Campus Martius, the Field of Mars, today inside Rome, but then outside the city proper, where he was interred in a tomb with the epitaph, "No better friend, no worse enemy." With Sulla's seizure of Rome, liquidation of enemies both real and perceived, consolidation of power, dictatorship, and reform program, the Roman world had become quite top-heavy. He had intended to normalize the system of checks and balances that distributed power among the optimates, or best men, but what he'd really done was create the blueprint for one-man rule. His death left a power vacuum in the Roman world, and there was really only one person with the experience, charisma, and reputation to step into the void: Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great. But at first, Pompey did, essentially, nothing. He disbanded his troops, most of whom returned to the Pompey family power base of Picenum. Pompey supported various candidates for office and generally enjoyed his moment of prestige and public adoration. He even got married again, wedding the widow of the late but not terribly lamented Gaius Marius the Younger, a woman named Mucia Tertia. His third marriage would eventually produce 3 children, a girl and 2 boys. Life was good for Pompey. At the same time, things were challenged for Rome itself. Despite Sulla's best efforts, other people of ambition had caught on to the idea that one man could run the show. The consul of 78 BCE was one such individual. Marcus Aemilius Lepidus had agitated to pull back some of Sulla's laws and generally proved to be a nuisance. If you're familiar with Roman history and the name Lepidus rings a bell, then yes, this one is the father of that Lepidus, the future triumvir and partner of Octavian and Mark Antony in the Second Triumvirate. The family was always long on ambition, but short on talent. When this Lepidus' term of office was nearing its end, he agitated to stand for the consulship again, a flagrant violation of Sulla's 10-year reform. When his demand was declined by the Senate, he took his army and stirred up a rebellion, enlisting several prominent Romans, including Marcus Junius Brutus, yes, father of that Brutus, in the cause. The Senate quickly organized a response, including ordering the other consul, an avowed Sullan partisan named Quintus Lutucius Catulus, to organize the troops and quell the rebellion. But Catulus was more of a politician than a general, and the Senate needed some military heft to quash the uprising. They turned, naturally, to Pompey, who quickly responded to the call to save his country. Given the rank of propraetor, essentially the rank of praetor without holding the office, Pompey gathered up a force from among his veterans in Picenum and marched them to confront Brutus. Catulus, meanwhile, prepared to confront Lepidus. In short order, Pompey cornered Brutus and laid siege to Mutina, the capital of the Roman province of Cisalpine Gaul. Brutus's troops, perhaps cowed by the reputation of Pompey, surrendered, and Brutus gave up. Pompey let him go free. Exactly what happened next is a bit unclear, but it appears that Pompey quickly sent word to the Senate that he won his confrontation without firing a shot, but then he also dispatched secret orders to an assassin to track down and dispatch Brutus, which was done the very next day. Catulus then bested Lepidus, and the rebellion collapsed. As Lepidus marched away with the remnants of his shattered army, Pompey caught up with him and engaged in their rear guard. Lepidus and a hollow core of his army slipped away and made their way to Sardinia, where Lepidus promptly died. The cause of death, according to the historian Plutarch, was not disease or assassination, but of a broken heart upon finding out that his wife had been carrying on an affair. This rebellion probably seemed like a very big deal at a time. A sitting consul, backed by a consular army, made a play to invade and take over Rome, following the script of Sulla. But rather than tip Rome into a full-scale civil war, Lepidus' revolt flamed out before it really got started. It's noteworthy to our story because it shows the trust that Senate placed in Pompey as a defender of the Republic, and the ease with which he could muster troops, bringing them into the field and to obliterate an army. He was still not even 30, and he was, to many Romans, the savior of his country, the indispensable man, the heir of Sulla, and of unsurpassed prestige. At this point, there's a slight lull for Pompey, a chance for him to gather his breath and bask in the torrents of glory and adulation that came his way. He was still so young, and yet he had already done so much. Since he's at a bit of a break, and since his future is going to be quite jam-packed, let's let him enjoy his rest and pause the story for today. By 25, he'd already been hailed as the Great. Where could he possibly go from here? We're 2 episodes into the story of Pompey, and we are just scratching the surface. Thank you for listening to this episode. I'm grateful that you did. Join us on the next one, when Pompey fights in the East, fights in the West, and fights right here at home in Italy.